Blessings in Jesus' name. Question. If when the High Court, who represent the state, they're an organ of the state, recognise that somebody has been wrongfully imprisoned, which means they were wrongfully arrested, which means they were wrongfully charged, which means they were wrongfully treated in the courts in order to be denied bail and imprisoned. If that arrest resulted of a civil order, which was later found unlawfully given, all of the events that came as a result of that civil order were wrongfully engaged in. It's not good enough for underlings or subordinates or those who take up office of a lesser rank to behave unlawfully because their superiors told them to. That is not acceptable excuse for unlawful behaviour within any jurisdiction, any dispensation of authority, or within any organ of the state. It's not good enough to say, my boss told me to, when you know better. And the idea that there are people saying that you must presume something constitutional until it has been shown not to be is mindless, because the Constitution shows us when something's unconstitutional. It's not like we're awaiting some information. We have it. It's called the Constitution. So you're, as a citizen, required to know the Constitution. You can purchase it. It's relatively inexpensive, around €5. You can get it online. You can get it in the form of an application. You can get it in digital format, in other words, and you can download it from the internet. It's not very expensive, and it's not a very lengthy read. But it is incumbent upon every citizen to have enough knowledge of that Constitution so that they know how they're expected to behave, because ignorance is no excuse in law. You can't say, Judge, I'm sorry, I didn't know. No, you broke the law, citizen. You should have known. So, equally is the same situation expected of the judiciary itself. It's not good enough for them to say, we didn't know. They are the representatives of the law. They're the representatives of the Constitution, the very organ that upholds it. So when they tell us that they don't know, or we've got to presume something is lawful in the absence of their testing it, we've got a serious problem. A serious, systemic, conspiratorial, military attack which has been mobilised through the organs of state. And they're playing dumb. They're playing ignorant, when it's not an acceptable position for them to hold, because they expect the citizen not to hold it. We're the district court, but we've got to assume that the legislature is a constitutional when they tell us to do it. What? You're saying that the President of Ireland, whoever's elected President, can say, I'm going to write this into the legislature, and you've got to presume it's constitutional, even though I don't have to test it for its constitutionality before I sign it into the legislature. What? You're going to place the President, who's not necessarily a barrister at law, isn't even required to have that level of understanding of the law, and you're going to allow him to be the sole individual who has the say whether something's committed to the law or not? even though they're saying there's no incumbency or responsibility upon him to test whether it's constitutional or not before he signs it in? Have you lost the plot? And while he has signed it in, even in the absence of him testing it for its constitutionality, the citizens have to presume it's constitutional. What? At the same time, you're telling us ignorance is no excuse? Are you for real? Have you abandoned basic common sense? Are they wearing clown costumes up there? Because when you say, I'm the president, I'm going to sign something in, I'm going to sign it into the legislature, I don't even have to test whether it's constitutional or not. I'm not the best person to ask about the law because I'm not a barrister at law. I have access to the Supreme Court in order to test whether something is constitutional or not, but there's no incumbency upon me to do so. So I can sign it in whether I use the Supreme Court to check it for its constitutionality or not. And even if I fail to test it for its constitutionality, you've got to presume it's constitutional, good citizen. Okay? Ignorance is no excuse. What? Who let the Sesame Street into the organs of state? So they're saying, yes, you have a democracy, of course you do, but the president can do whatever he wants, okay? He's effectively a dictator. But we'll say, yes, you have a constitution, but we don't have to do anything about that, okay? We'll just write whatever we want, and you've got to presume it's constitutional, good citizen, okay? Ignorance is no excuse. Right? Ignorance is no excuse. So why are we presuming something's constitutional then? Why? Why would we presume it's constitutional? If ignorance is no excuse, there would be no need for presumption. Now you're telling us contradictory things. Ignorance is no excuse, citizen. Okay, but I can't know whether what you're telling me to do is constitutional or not until you say it's constitutional based upon a testing of the constitutionality of it. Presume it's constitutional, citizen. Ignorance is no excuse. What? Yeah, the president, well, he can just sort of write whatever he wants into the legislature, not the constitution now, the legislature. Oh, he can write things into law, in other words. Yeah, well, he can say they're law, but they don't actually have to be. Why? Because he isn't required to use what he has access to when he's signing something in. Okay, so he's allowed to use the Supreme Court, and they're available to him any time he wants to test the constitutionality of something. Yeah, he has access to the Supreme Court. He's the president. He can employ the Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of something at any stage. Okay, so the best time to do that would be when you're deciding whether to sign something into the law or not. Yeah, exactly. So does he do that? No. Why? He doesn't have to presume it's constitutional. Ignorance is no excuse, citizen. What? Who let Sesame Street into the government? Yeah, it's a democracy. What do you mean it's democracy? We didn't have any say over what the president signed in that time. Oh yeah, he just wrote it in. Oh yeah. Did he well, it has to be constitutional. Yeah, but he doesn't have to test it for its constitutionality. So effectively he's a dictator? Yes, not really though, because we just tell him what to write and what to sign in. So he's kind of like more like our puppet than a dictator. Who's we? Freemasonry. The synagogue of Satan. We pretty much put him there, that president in Ireland. He's a Freemason. We put him there in 2011. This is his second term, and he's made a complete mess of it in just 14 years. And all the while they're telling you, just presume what the President is writing is constitutional. He can test it for its constitutionality, but he doesn't have to. But you've got to presume it's constitutional, even though he hasn't tested it, even though he has access to the Supreme Court to test it if he wants to, any time he wants to, but he didn't. So you just presume it's constitutional. Who let Sesame Street in? To the government. They're monsters, Sesame Street. So they go in there and go blah 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 blah. And then they sign all sorts of debauched things that go against the word of God into the legislature. And they go, we could have tested it. We had access to test it. We could have brought it to the Supreme Court to test it for its constitutionality. But we didn't because we don't have to. But you've got to presume that it's constitutional, okay? Ignorance is no excuse. So that works two ways. Ignorance is no excuse. Your ignorance of whether something is constitutional or not is no excuse for you writing something into the law that's not constitutional. You're writing things into the legislature which aren't constitutional. And you're telling the citizens ignorance is no excuse. And you're saying we didn't test it for its constitutionality, even though you had access to. And it's your responsibility to make sure that what you're signing in as law is constitutional or not. Because if you don't, what effectively you're doing is high treason. You're doing it twice. Because first you lied to the people saying that you don't have to test something for its constitutionality when you absolutely do. You're not entitled to sign something into the legislature that isn't constitutional, especially when you have access to the Supreme Court to test it for its constitutionality before you sign it in. That's not optional. It's not optional. So you can say it's optional, but it's not. You have to test something for its constitutionality before you ask people to obey it. And stop making up terms like presumptively constitutional, because that's pig dung. Good citizen, presume that what we're telling you is the law, even though we don't know whether it is or not yet. Because we didn't bother our Barneys testing. But you pay us a lot of money. But we didn't test. But ignorance is no excuse, citizen. Really? They're committing high treason left, right and centre, coming against the Irish Constitution, and they're not even checking what they're writing down for its constitutionality or not at the time prior to when they sign it in. Not even bothering. We can test it in the Supreme Court if we want to, but we don't have to. Why wouldn't you? Why would anybody in their right mind not test it for its constitutionality unless they knew it was unconstitutional and wanted to sign it in anyway? And didn't want to have to say, well, we tested it for its constitutionality, so we can't sign it in. That's why they don't test it for its constitutionality. Not because they don't have access to the Supreme Court, not because they shouldn't, but because they don't want to. Because if they did, they wouldn't sign it in and be able to tell you to obey what is unconstitutional. They're criminals. It is a witchcraft coven, Sesame Street, up in the Dáil. It's the synagogue of Satan, and they are absolutely as bold as you like, relying upon your ignorance. Ignorance is no excuse, citizen. But they would rather you didn't know. It's just so that they could deny you your rights. Which is to know, not just presume, to know that what they're asking you to do is constitutional. They have absolutely no right and no authority to tell you to obey something that they don't know is constitutional. They're inciting crime if they do. If they tell you to obey something that isn't constitutional, they are committing a crime. Ignorance is no excuse, politicians. Ignorance is no excuse, Michael D. Higgins. Ignorance is no excuse, courts. Ignorance is no excuse, judiciary. High treason. Jesus is Lord.